That was a teacher's rate for sure. I don't know.
All right, we wanted to. No, I just. Let's try to get settled with artists and folks are meeting that are going to be joining us remotely via Zoom. A warm welcome to everyone tonight. It's beautiful, beautiful summer's days here in Michigan. Almost hated to come here, although I know it's going to be a stimulating conversation tonight, so it'll be worth it. Missing the sunny evening. Just one or two housekeeping before I introduce. One is that today's session is hybrid. I think most of you know that, so it's going to be recorded, and there are people joining us as I'm sure as we're starting right now. We're going to have the introduction. I'll do a brief introduction. Then Stephanie is going to do the presentation. Then we're going to have a question and answer session. And then Mary Flores, who's our Vice President of Membership, is going to say a word about if you're not a GLUNA member, why you should become a GLUNA member, and all the wonderful benefits that you'll accrue from your membership. Just a little bit for those of you who are not familiar with GLUNA, I think most of you are very familiar with GLUNA. GLUNA is a part of the United Nations Association USA, an education and advocacy group for the UN. And in recent years, with very special attention to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in 2015 by the United Nations. And the collaboration and expansion of the 8 Millennium Development Goals that many of us remember that were adopted in 2000. So the SDGs have become a central component of both the UN's agenda for sustainable development and our own programming at GLUNA as well. And tonight's presentation, actually, we try to do this with all of our presentations, is to see how they align to one or more of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So tonight, our presentations will be highlighting Goal 3, good health and well-being, Goal 5, gender and equality, and Goal 13, climate action. In addition to the Java cafes, which are regularly held, the GLUNA also sponsors other activities throughout the year. And coming up in October, I think it's the 23rd, is it, or 22nd, is our biggest event of the year, which is our UN Day celebration, which takes place at the Kellogg Center. So hopefully all of us will be able to attend that. Also, I was going to mention this, but because we have one of the special guests here tonight, I want to mention this. One of the things that we do is we have a number of awards that we give out every year, including a Global Educator of the Year award that goes to a teacher or an educator, and a Global Student of the Year award. And we have Reasia Fletcher from Waverly High School. There, Robert Laurie, who's also a member of our board, and we were able to. We were honored 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, to actually present this certificate to her at the senior recognition night, and she was the audience responded very well to when her name was read and I read the citation to her. So congratulations again, Reasia, and welcome to our session tonight. Today's Java Cafe, as we know, is in recognition of World Refugee Day and World Refugee Week, which is all of this week, and there's a variety of programming I know happening throughout Lansing this week, focusing on refugees. Our speaker tonight is no stranger to many of us. He is Stephanie Nawyn, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. And just as importantly, because this is where many of us know her more through the Sociology Department, she was co-director of the Center for Gender and Global Context for the last 7 years, 2016. And I think it's just 2 weeks ago or last week.
Just last Thursday was my last day.
Yeah, last Thursday was her last day. Her research and teaching expertise are in migration, refugees, and gender, with a focus on refugees, resettlement, and humanitarian assistance for refugees in the Middle East. Her current project examines adherence to COVID-19 safety protocols during the service of refugees in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. Her most recent articles were published in the Journal of Refugee Studies, Journal of Ethnic and Racial Studies, Disaster and Emergency Medicine, and the Journal of Immigration and Minority Health. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge with us.
So, can you hear me now?
Just
How did that go?
Oh, did I?
I'm sure you did nothing. Technology sometimes doesn't like us very much. Hello? I wonder if the battery just literally died right now. Oh, here we go. There we go. Just need a little close. Thank you so much for that wonderful, warm introduction, and thank you all for coming today. I was asked to talk about some different sustainability goals, and we discussed and thought that gender, obviously, because that is actually my area of expertise, but recently I have kind of moved into the areas of refugees and health with a project, as John mentioned, looking at how COVID-19 protocols were enforced during humanitarian assistance in the Middle East. And then very recently, I just submitted a couple papers now on conflict and climate change and how that's affecting the displacement of people. So I thought we would, for this presentation, these are the three SDGs that I'll be talking about today. But before I get directly into the development goals, I thought it would be worth talking a little bit broad picture about how we think about refugees, because it just decided I wasn't worth it. Okay. Hello. Okay. It might just be a loose, whatever. I don't pretend to understand. That's why I brought my husband with me. He's my okay. So, because I really want to loop back in at the end of the presentation once we've done talking about the Sustainable Development Goals to really, get back to. I just hello. I'm just worried. I mean, I can talk very loudly. Should I just do that? I'm worried that people won't hear me. And we'll do that. Okay. Going, right? So the way we talk about refugees, when we think about refugees, really affects the kinds of action we take to advocate for them, and to the point where I actually thought about not using the term refugees as a noun anymore, but rather. There we go. Actually thought about referring to people as people with refugee visas, because we kind of solidify the idea that refugee-ness is a set identity. And I really want to address some of the complexity of that tonight. So, but first, I have okay. So there's lots of discourse about refugees in the public discourse, and some of that I think is used with good intentions. And some of it is not good intentions. I'm going to talk about both of these, but this we hear a lot of water. Hello? Hello? As a professor, I really think I need to ask, am I going to still get this additional time, or am I going to have to
You wish.
how long
I think.
Yeah. Whenever you get to. Hello? Here we go. That's fine. Okay, so we hear a lot of water metaphors, right? Some of it is innocuous, like a flow. Other times it's, with the reference to like a deluge, right? But the water metaphors are. Okay, these water metaphors are pretty common and usually give the impression that we are going to be inundated by refugees somehow. And so you can see in this cartoon from Europe, there are two older people on the beach, both of them white, if you can't see from the room there in the back, with a little sign that says Europe and this giant tidal wave of refugees crashing onto Europe's shores. This one, if you remember, Trump Jr. Likening refugees to poison candy. That sure, most of them are fine, but some of them are terrorists. And if you knew that 3 of these Skittles in a bowl, a giant bowl of Skittles were terrorists, would kill you? Would you eat them? So we hear a lot of these discourses. Actually, some of the discourse about refugees coming out of Europe specifically around sexual violence, so graphic, I can't even show it without some sort of trigger warning. And the more well-meaning, well-intentioned discourse is about refugees in crisis, right? And this is what we commonly see: refugees getting off boats, refugees in camps, refugees in some sort of state of distress. But we don't often see refugees sitting in restaurants they own, just kind of hanging out with family members, sharing their culture and their foods with other people. These are the images of refugees we don't see. And if you look at any of these photos, you would never know that any of these people are refugees, right? And I think that's kind of the point, that refugees are people who are very much like you and me. They went to jobs, they were in school, they argued with their spouses, they got mad at their kids, they read the paper, they hung out, they cleaned the house, whatever. Whatever it was that they did, and then something really happened in their country, and they had to flee. And oftentimes we only think of refugees as permanently being in this state, like trapped in this, like an aspect, right? In this moment of time in which they are and forever will be in crisis. And we don't often think of them in this kind of scenario. It's just kind of normal, average people having normal, average lives. And so I think it's really important to kind of hold that idea as I go through this presentation. So I did want to give some context for those who might not be familiar with the existing situation with refugees. I always try not to use the word refugee crisis. Certainly there is a crisis in certain places. There are, countries like Jordan, which has about 1 in 3 people are refugees in Jordan. Countries that have seen very large numbers of recently arrived refugees. Those, I don't even know if those are crises, but there's certainly challenges. The U.S.'s refugee situation, I think, does not constitute a crisis. It barely constitutes a challenge, maybe in certain places. And whenever it's a challenge that was created by people other than the refugees. So the largest number of refugees still is from Syria. Syria has about 6.8 million refugees right now. The number of people internally displaced in Syria is close to twice that number. So, and that's usually the case. There's always more people internally displaced than there are people displaced outside of the country. Remember, to be a refugee, you have to have left your country because of persecution or fear of persecution. The second largest group right now is Ukraine at 5.4 million, and then Afghanistan, which their numbers had gone down quite a bit, and there were, like 20 years ago, there were former Afghan refugees who were returning to Afghanistan, people who had education that wanted to help rebuild their country. That has since disintegrated, as we know, and then there's been a number of conflicts that have broken out in various African countries that constitute the rest of the 10 largest sending countries. Now, these are people who are being given legal refugee status. One of the largest displaced populations is actually from Venezuela, but very few of them have been given refugee status. I think this is really important. So this graph is from the Brookings Institute, from a report they wrote on how Venezuelans were going to become the big refugee crisis. And they refer to them as refugees here, but in actuality, of these 5.3 million Venezuelans who have been displaced outside of the country, a really small number of them have been given refugee status. And what that means is many of them are living in other countries with liminal status or no status at all. They are living without authorization in the countries that they're in, usually without the right to work, the right to access health care, whatever it is that they need. The children don't necessarily have the right to go to school. It varies by country where they are, but on the whole, this is a population that would constitute refugees if they were given that legal recognition. So they live as refugees except without any of the rights that come with being a refugee. Now, how many of these refugees come to the US? So it's important to note that only about 1%, usually a little less, of all refugees worldwide ever get resettled. Resettlement is considered one of the 3 durable solutions. The first is repatriation, they return back to their home country. The second is settlement in the country of first asylum. So Syrians who moved to Turkey and then settled permanently in Turkey. Turkey has just recently agreed to give, they announced that Syrians would be eligible for citizenship. They've actually not given very many Syrian citizenship, but at least they said they're going to. Or resettlement, which is third country resettlement, so coming to someplace like the United States. That happens very, very rarely. The US, though, historically has been a big resettlement country. In 1980, when the US Refugee Act was passed, this was the first legislation that gave us a regular way of receiving refugees, helping them to integrate, identifying who could come in. We had upwards of 220 to 240,000 refugees coming in each year. Those are mostly from Vietnam and former Soviet republics. And then the numbers kind of, popped up whenever there was a big refugee situation that had national interest in the US. So in the 90s, that was the Bosnian War, the kind of collapse of Yugoslavia, and the Bosnians, Herzegovinians, Croatians coming, mostly Bosnians. And then, and that blue line, I'm sorry, I think the room isn't quite big enough and the screen isn't quite large enough for you to see it. The blue line is the annual ceiling. That is the number that Congress signs off on and says, this is how many refugees we will pay for. Right, so the president is the one who makes a request of a certain ceiling, and then Congress signs off on that because this is a budgetary item as well as a political one. Congress has to agree to that. The ceiling would go up whenever there was some need, and then go back down whenever that particular refugee crisis was over. You can see that big gap that you see between the ceiling and the number, the orange line, which is the number of admitted refugees. That is from 9/11. So we have, kind of a similar ceiling that we had from previous years. But what happened in 9/11 was all refugee admissions were halted. Everyone stopped, including people who had already been approved to come into the United States. And they put everybody, that is, they passed security checks, they passed health checks, they stopped all refugee resettlement. They created a new security process that involves, last I counted, 7 different federal agencies, also includes biometric, like you actually have to do genetic testing now, sometimes to prove that you have a family member that you want to bring with you is actually a close enough family member to come with you. And they restarted some resettlement from certain countries after about 3 or 4 months. So that was mostly Ukrainians at the time. Refugees from Africa didn't restart for another 2 years. So there was certainly, some racialization of who was allowed to restart their resettlement and who was not. And then that big drop in the ceiling, that was Trump, right? That was the Trump administration. During the Trump administration, we lost almost, because the funding from resettlement agencies comes from the number of refugees we resettle. And the United States lost almost half of all the resettlement agencies and closed because the number of refugees coming was so small for a long enough period of time that they just couldn't keep their funding limit. Now I want to give a shout out to Ben Kavanaugh, who is the refugee state coordinator from Michigan. He did some amazingly creative work to help all the resettlement agencies in Michigan stay funded. He found ways for them to serve other populations. He found funding for them to serve populations that had already been resettled that still needed other kinds of assistance. I don't know that we lost any of our resettlement agencies in the state of Michigan, which is really quite impressive. But so and then Biden came in 2/21. This was a response to Ukraine and to Afghanistan. That the numbers, the ceiling went way up again, but we don't quite have the infrastructure to do all the security checks, to do all of the resettlement agencies. There has to be an agency that sponsor them. The State Department just announced in January a new program called Welcome For that creates a private sponsorship model similar to what Canada uses. Canada, not all the refugees that go to Canada are privately sponsored, but I think most of them are, or at least half of them are. And the United States wants to do this. I'm not going to talk a lot about that tonight unless you have questions. I have a lot of opinions about Welcome For. So this drop during the Trump administration was a real change historically in the place that U.S. Held globally in terms of resettlement. So the blue line is the resettlement. What's the number? I'm sorry. Oh, it's the number of refugees resettled in the thousands. And the blue line is for the United States, and the green line is all other countries. So for starting, right in 1980, the United States resettled about half of the world's resettled refugees, which is pretty amazing. We had, you can see in 2001 that dropped because of 9/11 and the drop in our emissions. But it's been back up, and so historically, most refugees who were resettled came to the US, and then the remainder were split among many other countries. Some countries only resettled very, very small numbers, like Japan. I remember when the UNHCR was so excited when they got Japan to agree to resettle refugees. It was like 300 refugees a year. This was like 2007, 2006, and around there. They were so excited about this. And a lot of countries that do resettlement only resettle very small numbers. The US does not resettle the largest numbers per capita, and it doesn't resettle the largest number per GDP. So we are not the biggest resettlement country in terms of our population size or our budget or economy, but in terms of just raw numbers, we had been the major resettlement country. We'll see what happens in the next several years as we rebuild our resettlement capacity. Okay, so that's the context that I wanted to give you before I dig into the Sustainable Development Goals. So I could probably talk about this for hours. So if you have questions, by all means, it's I love it. I think there are two ways of thinking about how gender is shaping, gender equity specifically is shaping refugee migrations. One is in how, who is forced to flee, so who leaves. We call it forced migration, kind of in the discipline, but it's not, I mean, I don't think there's too many situations in which people are literally forced to flee. It's still a choice, but it is a highly constrained choice. For some people, it is a very kind of long thought out strategic thing. Things are looking really bad. We're from an ethnic group that is getting targeted more and more. I'll just say as an aside, the US is not immune to this. There are actually now people talking about transgender Americans being the new group of US asylum seekers. That might be, right? So people are looking around and going, okay, things are looking sketchy. And maybe they save some money or they get an opportunity to go, and I think we can claim asylum in this country. And we have family here, we have a cousin, we have an aunt, and I think we can do. Other people like grab the nearest kid and run, right? So it is a range of different kinds of choices, but there's some compelling to having to leave. So one thing, it's just kind of these like very basic things that shape who ends up leaving. So we know that men and women have different kinds of opportunities in the workforce, in labor, and different kinds of family care responsibilities. And this actually shapes people's ability to lead or their need to lead. So men are more likely in these kinds of situations to be pressed into military service or paramilitary service, right? So this means either they're not going to leave because they end up with groups fighting. And this isn't just press, sometimes it's volunteer. So this happened early on in the Syrian civil war. A lot of the people, the Syrians coming to Turkey originally, like back in 2013, right? We were there in 2013, were women and children, girl children and boy children under the age of like 16. And that's because 16 and up men, young boys and men, were fighting. Many of them had joined some sort of, this was back when there were these like civilian, now it's professionalized, insurgent groups and a lot of transnational insurgent groups. It's not teachers and doctors and taxi drivers picking up guns, but originally that's what it was. And so a lot of people crossing the border were women and children. They were not men. So or men might leave first because they don't want to be pressed into military service. So we might see they know that their wives and their daughters and sisters are not necessarily in danger, but they are. So in that situation, they might go first. There are a lot of countries that have circular migration that men especially participate in. This happened in Madagascar. There was a lot of women and children showing up on the borders, and they thought the men had all been killed or the men had been pressed into military service, but actually because there's a circular labor migration out of, maybe it wasn't Madagascar, it was Mozambique, I'm sorry, to South Africa, where they would go to South Africa, work for a while in cities, and then go back home. Well, when the fighting broke out, they just didn't go back home. Why do that, right? So their wives and their children got out to safety, and they stayed in South Africa so they could be reunited with their families or bring their families to South Africa. So sometimes we see very gendered kinds of migrations where certain gender groups are overrepresented, and you have to really, you have to talk to people, and you have to find out, what kind of underlying dynamics were going on in the country before people were forced out. In general, women are less mobile, and this is why we see when there is more choice to who leaves and when you leave, that women are usually underrepresented, especially if they are women with children or women with older people to care for. We have this term called selective migration, that the harder it is to move, you tend to see very select groups being able to. With forced migration, with refugees, there's less selectivity, right? You won't see an elderly grandmother leave, Honduras to go to the United States to find work. But you might see an elderly grandmother from Honduras leave to flee violence. But more likely is younger people, and especially if she doesn't have the money to fly, if she doesn't have the money to hire someone, a smuggler or someone else to help her get there, and you have to walk, grandma cannot walk. And so this is where we see a lot of people, their families are fractured. They have to leave behind family members that are sick and elderly because the only way to move is so difficult. They're not going to be able to do it. And so, women, because they have these care responsibilities, tend to be less mobile. And if they're caring for elderly people, they may not be able to go, or they may have to leave those elderly family members behind. Mobility also tends to be more dangerous for women. So women are, there's different kinds of violence, and I don't want to diminish the kinds of violence men experience. In general, men are more often the victims of violence. Their risk of homicide is higher, but the kinds of violence women are exposed to is very specific, right? And so I think I'm just getting really excited and squeezing the forward button. Women have to think about the dangers of sexual violence, and because those have very particular cultural connotations, it's one thing to get beat up or robbed, but if a woman is raped, that may create all sorts of problems for her afterwards, within her community, within her family. If she becomes pregnant from a sexual assault, that creates a whole other level of problems that she's going to have to deal with. And so, again, depending upon what kind of movement we're talking about, women may not be able to make that very easily, or it might cost a lot more. And this is what, kind of the really awful situation is. If somebody is fleeing the situation where they should be considered refugees and should be given international protection, they often still have to think about hiring a smuggler to move illegally. It's not just about not being allowed to leave their country, but they have to get into another country. And increasingly, that is becoming harder and harder. And so it's not just about showing up and saying, I request asylum. It's about spending thousands of US dollars to get smuggled someplace so that you can then request asylum. And even then, we know like policies in the US-Mexico border, which, very few Mexicans now are showing up. It's Central Americans, it's Nicaraguans, Venezuelans, it's Ukrainians, it's Ethiopians. The US is not letting them come in, right? And then they have no obligation to protect them if they never step foot on US soil. So gender also shapes who receives help. So women are often viewed as more vulnerable and less culpable for the situation of having to move. They are considered more likely to be real refugees, and so sometimes they're given a little bit more benefit of the doubt when in asylum hearings or refugee adjudication. Everybody gets questioned, everybody gets interviewed, and this is often why it takes years and years for someone to become, once they've even been identified as a refugee, to come to the United States. They say, you're eligible to be resettled in the US, but it takes average of 2 years. For some people, it's closer to 7 years because of all the different situations they have to be interviewed about. Part because women are viewed as more vulnerable, more programs are focused on women. And so if you look at the kinds of things that UNHCR provides, other nonprofits, there's a lot, and funders really want to focus things on women. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but then what we see is that the particular needs of men don't always get addressed. And this can also be a problem for women because many women have men in their families. And so I have a friend and colleague who does work in Lebanon. I'm sorry, I can't remember if it's Jordan or Lebanon. Jordan, sorry. A friend who does work in Jordan on this, where there's a lot of focus on helping women enter, livelihoods work, right? Finding ways to make money. Very much less than men. And it's not a good situation for those young men and boys, but it's also a bad situation in general because if you want a society without conflict, you need to not have a whole bunch of young men with nothing to do and no way to feel like they're doing something valuable, they have dignity. It almost invariably leads to more conflict. There's some really interesting kind of epidemiological work that looks at kind of the dangers of, unoccupied young men. That it's just a particular gender and age group that need help integrating in, and if they don't have that help, they tend to get into trouble. Men are also to be viewed as more dangerous. And this is not just men's greater propensity for violence compared to women, but they're more likely to be seen as the terrorist elements of a refugee group. And so again, not always given much leeway or much benefit of the doubt in these adjudications. I should say too, because sometimes there are these gender barriers to men being seen as refugees and getting refugee status and being resettled somewhere, there's this problem of, and these are definitely not defending them, men who claim they are married to a woman who's likely to get refugee status, and then pressuring that woman to support that claim. So if there's a woman who's without a husband and she has children, a man will say, okay, well, I'm going to be your husband now, and threatens her. And so you have UNHCR and other organizations trying to parse out what's going on with there to keep this woman safe, and just the fact that happens sometimes then makes other men who are legitimately married to women and in a family unit that needs to be resettled, it puts them in danger, right? Because then these UNHCR interviewers get very, suspicious and jaded. Barbara Harrell-Bond is this, she's since passed, but was a very well-known professor at Oxford University, and she started the Refugee Study Center in Kampala, Uganda. And she said that, she would go to this place where people would wait for refugee interviews, and the adjudicator would come out and say, okay, I'm ready to hear your lies. Just very, so, you don't want to encourage that kind of behavior by having this kind of fraud happening. And then, sort of when we're talking about individual asylum claims, where you're not part of a large group, like you're Syrian and you live your particular, particular sect of Islam, and you lived in a certain city. That's all you have to do to prove that you are a legitimate refugee. But when you're having to talk about particular persecution that you as an individual experience, men are more likely to be persecuted by agents of the state, arrested and tortured by the police. The military picked them up. The military came into their home. Women are more likely to be persecuted by non-state actors. So there's some really interesting work here on LGBTQ people who are requesting asylum. So gay men are more likely to be physically, sexually assaulted by the police. For women, it's sometimes a family member who is persecuting them. Or, the father will beat a gay woman who's his daughter, or hire some, or get friends, male friends, to sexually assault her, to make her straight. And that kind of persecution is not seen as persecution. It's just seen as violence. And remember, to have refugee status, you have to be persecuted for particular reasons, and the state, your country, your nation state, has to be unable or unwilling to protect you. So if the police or the military are persecuting you, straightforward, the state is not protecting you. If it's a family member, or if it's a neighbor, or a religious leader, I mean, just report it to the police. Why don't you just, right? So women actually have a harder time when using asylum claims, because they're getting the same treatment is seen as not evidence that the state is unwilling or unable to protect her, because it's a non-state agent who's attacking her. Okay, so I'll move on to health. I put this big project in the Middle East, and I decided I didn't want to talk too much about it because it felt too much in the weeds, and honestly, maybe a little boring. So maybe because I've been up to my earlobes in it for a couple of years now. But I thought it'd be better to have like a big picture, like what's going on with particular health vulnerabilities of refugees. So because of often being in crowded camps, or although I have to say some of the camps are less crowded than the urban neighborhoods. It kind of depends on the camp and the urban neighborhood. Last March, I went to a Palestinian refugee camp right in the heart of Beirut, and the streets are about this wide, not wide enough for a car. You just ride motorcycles around, because it was a camp that's now buildings, and this camp has been there since, I don't know, this one was there in the late 40s or early 50s, but it's a pretty old camp. And as their families grew, they had children, and the children had children, they just built up. And so there's no water systems, water sewer systems or anything. There's just pipes running up above, like kind of right above your head. Jump, like you probably almost touch them. And so it's very, very crowded. And in that kind of situation, without good air circulation, you're just going to have more exposure to infectious disease. Poor mental health, not surprisingly, is a really big issue. That refugees tend to have a very large percentage, of course, have been tortured, but universally, levels of stress, not surprisingly, are extremely high. And refugees, in every study I've ever seen that looked at mental health, refugees, depression, anxiety, and PTSD levels are always higher than their the receiving population. And then there's always these challenges too of access for country healthcare systems. So there's the World Health Organization in their fact sheet, Refugee and Migrant Health, noted that many of them experience feelings of anxiety and sadness, hopelessness, difficulty sleeping, fatigue, irritability, anger, or aches and pains. But most of these people, for most of these people, their symptoms of distress improve over time. They do need to have some access to healthcare systems. And this is not, on that thing that they are able to access. They have some very good news. So just last, 5 days ago, 7 days ago, June 13th, there was a convening that happened in Morocco that produced the Rabat Declaration. This process started about a year ago. There was no UN documentation or agreements on refugees' access to healthcare in their countries of asylum or resettlement. There was no kind of universal right to this. And in the Rabat Declaration, this was the first UN document that says refugees need to have access to healthcare systems in the countries in which they live. So this was a culmination of the global consultations on the health of refugees and migrants that started last year in Istanbul and was signed by 30 countries. There's 120 some in the UN, but to start, right? 30 countries on June 13th at that convening, and I want to make sure I get this because so the countries like Turkey, Jordan, Morocco, Lebanon, places where there are lots of refugees protected, they actually were the lead signatories on this, and never get to say that the U.S. signed this. It always feels like every time I talk about anything, it's like, oh, the U.S. didn't. The U.S. signed this. So that was, and this spun me a bit. Canada did not. No. Now, I don't know if that's because Canada actually has a really good healthcare system and we don't, right? But Canada, United Kingdom, Germany, Norway, and Sweden, as well as some other countries in Europe that host a lot of refugees, did not sign up to the Rabat Declaration, but I was very happy that the US did. So, some good news for a change. Okay, now, moving on to climate change. This also, this is a huge area of research that is, I think, still really coming together. I see a lot of disagreements within the literature about the relationship between climate change and migration. So I'm kind of a cop-out, but I think this relationship is really complex. And I say that because there are a number of predictions based on where we think there's going to be various climate change-induced environmental catastrophes. And 50 million, 100 million people are going to be displaced. The response to that never seems to be, well, let's do something about climate change. It's not, let's try to help these, these communities become more sustainable. Let's help them adapt. Let's figure out, it's always panic, panic, don't let them in, right? So I think it's important to note that environment environmental catastrophes don't perfectly predict migration. And you know, even if it's pushing out a lot of people from a place, if they can't come here, they can't come here. And I think we have to make a decision about what we want to be as a human society. Are we just going to build walls and let people die on the outside? Or are we going to try to do something about this? It's moving, especially moving permanently, is not a decision that is done easily. And even when it seems obvious that people should leave, many people don't. We talk about how many migrants there are in the world. There's more people who stay, right? And think about Syria, where whole cities have been destroyed. There's twice as many people who moved to another part of Syria as people who moved out of Syria. So this idea that refugees are inherently going to happen because of these climate catastrophes, I think is overly simplistic and only seems to be used to scare us into building higher walls. The irony, though, is that the countries that are most impacted by climate change are also the ones hosting most refugees. So most refugees go to a country next to their home country. They're not moving far away. And these are often poor countries that are ill prepared for climate-induced environmental crises. And it's just kind of a really bad situation. There's a lot of overlap between the countries that are poor right now and the countries that are going to be most impacted by climate change. And climate change does have some relationship to conflict. So if you look back to the origins of the war in Syria, actually, I mean, this is a little bit disputed, and I'll tell you why. But there's a story about how lack of rainfall in parts of Syria led to drought, and people left their farms and moved to cities. And then the cities became overcrowded and all these tensions that led to kind of an uprising that then the Syrian dictator tried to put down, and thus the civil war began. I think this is a good point, though. Some people will challenge that narrative because it's not climate change that's creating the conflict. It's our poor response to climate change that creates the conflict, right? So instead of seeing what could be done to help farmers in this area, nothing was done. And then they adapted as best they could, and that led to conflict. In Turkey, for example, they're having some serious problems with drought in the eastern part of the country, where there are a lot of Syrian refugees that have become essential to farming. They are what we think of as Mexican farm labor. That's what the Syrians are doing in Turkey. And instead of doing something about the drought conditions and helping farmers in the eastern part of the country, the Turkish government is like, well, you've got cheap labor, so it's okay if it becomes more expensive, if you have to do more, irrigation, because you've got cheap labor. So the refugees become the reason why we don't need to do anything about climate change. So I think it's always something to remember that climate change doesn't automatically, it could be different. It doesn't automatically create conflict. It doesn't automatically create displacement. Our poor response to climate change creates conflict and creates displacement. So, and women refugees, because often in these climate high impacted areas, they're the ones who are growing, sustainable agriculture, sustenance agriculture. So they're the ones collecting water. So once again, the kinds of responsibilities that women have put them in the roles of being most impacted by these problems. Now, I want to quickly address this idea of climate refugees. This term is all over the place right now. And whether it's being inundated by floods or drought conditions, or whatever the environmental catastrophe is, the story is always that it leads to movements of people. And so I really just want to problematize that. Not only that, but call into question this idea of a climate refugee. Right now, we have no legal category for people who are fleeing climate catastrophes to seek refugee protection. There is no such legal thing as a climate refugee. So sometimes people will instead refer to environmental migrants or climate migrants, but calling them refugees assumes that they have legal rights that they do not have. This is a problem that we have to address. We've got island nations in the South Pacific that will be underwater in 40 years. And those people who will have no ground to stand on, have no legal right to go anywhere else. Someone probably will take them in. They might be able to migrate through some existing policies, but no, there is no legal standing for them to have the right to leave their waterlogged underwater country and go someplace. And it very well could happen that we just keep building, the rest of us just keep building walls. And so when you see this term climate refugee, I think it's really important to remind people that people fleeing climate disasters do not have the rights of refugees. Okay, so kind of in sum, we've got thinking about health, SDG 3, there are significant health vulnerabilities that we have to be addressed in order to help people, properly integrate into their home countries or in the receiving countries. There's, Cambodians when they came here in the 80s and 90s. We've got Cambodian parents that have untreated PTSD that are raising, Cambodian American children. That's doing their communities no good. There was no kind of, PTSD treatment for them at that time, and the children continue to suffer from that. And so we have multiple generations now of people who, because they didn't get the mental health care they needed, now their children are suffering from that. If we want to have healthy communities, we have to make sure everyone in our community is healthy. And when we have a group of people coming who have, serious PTSD problems and experience torture, we can't just go, get a job and then not consider you integrated. For gender, I think, thinking about the specific gender vulnerabilities and really, I think moving away from this idea of women and children, right? 80% of refugees are women and children. Okay, well, 80% of most populations are women and children. Right? What does it mean for women who are in this particular refugee situation? What does it mean for the men who are in this particular? There's lots of differences, and we don't serve refugees well by treating all women as more vulnerable than men, not seeing the resilience that women have, and then treating men like they don't really deserve resettlement. And I think there's a lot of kind of toxic masculinity built into this as well. The idea that if you were a real man, you wouldn't have been kicked out of your country, right? You would have stayed and fought. Whatever it is, I think thinking about the complexity of gender with the way refugees have experienced that is important. And then, just I think really highlighting how complex these interactions are with climate change and migration, but how climate disasters exacerbate these existing problems for refugees. It's bad enough that they, all the things they've experienced, and again, they are going to be the ones that are going to suffer the most from these degrading environment. So I did said I would talk a little bit about the UN and all this. I think it's really important to know the role that the UN has played and is the direction they're moving in terms of refugee protection. So this is the old logo for UNHCR. UNHCR stands for United Nations High Commission for Refugees. This is their new logo. They kept the UNHCR, but now they're just called the UN Refugee Agency. They're no longer a high commission for refugees. They're a refugee agency. And that, I think, represents two kind of movements that the UN and UNHCR had towards refugees. So there's been this mission creep. They really started out as being responsible for protecting and advocating for refugees, and they've moved more to the humanitarian assistance, which I think is important to note is kind of depoliticized. They're not advocating anymore, they're assisting. And they've expanded it to all displaced people. UNHCR doesn't work with Palestinians still. There's a whole other UN agency that does, UNRWA. But they are working more with internally displaced people. Internally displaced people are sometimes more vulnerable to violence because they're still in the middle of it, but they don't have the same political protection needs that refugees do. It's a different kind of need politically, and the UNHCR has been treating all these folks as just needing assistance. And then what they've done too is moved away from taking on nation states and saying, you have these international responsibilities. You need to do this. They are working with states to manage refugee populations. And that's a very different mission than advocating for refugees and protecting refugees. And I talked to some folks in Turkey about this, and they said, well, look, we're here at the behest of the Turkish government. And if the Turkish government wants to throw us out, they will. So we think about that every time we want to push for them to give refugee status to somebody. We remember that they could just tell us to leave tomorrow. So we started passing these difficult cases off to local NGOs, and say, you go fight your government because they won't kick you out, they can kick us out. So, also wanted to end with some ways that you can take action. So I think working on this locally is the best way to go. There are several organizations, many of you know them, some of you have worked with them. The refugees, I'll share these links with everybody. Refugee Development Center is a great organization that is always usually looking for volunteers. St. Vincent's Catholic Charities Refugee Services is the main resettlement agency here in Lansing. And then the Immigrant and Refugee Resource Collaborative is actually a group of all of these resettlement and community organizations, like the libraries are part of it, and school districts that come together to try to provide what they call a no wrong door policy. And they've been working a lot on how to build welcoming communities. So if you're interested, I would contact them. Also, since we're in a church, I'll mention that I had come across this Pew survey data a while back, which showed that this is a Pew study on the percent of people in the US who say we should accept refugees into the country. And when you break it out by race and religion, it's very interesting. Christians of color tend to be very supportive of bringing refugees here. And white people without a religious affiliation, or white people who are Jewish, they tend to be very supportive of refugees. But white Christians tend to be less supportive, and especially true of white evangelicals. And so I did step down from the GenCen. I'm officially on sabbatical as of Friday. And this is the project that I'm going to be working on. A project called Welcoming a New Neighbor, where I'm developing a curriculum, a 6-week curriculum for predominantly white Christian congregations that would be facilitated by like clergy or lay leaders in the congregation. The idea is to kind of address the anxieties and concerns and frustrations and anger and suspicion and probably racism and nationalism that people have to unpack that in a safe space where you're with other congregation members and you can talk about the things that frighten you and make you anxious in a place where you know people and you trust and you trust them, and then discuss as a faith community what you're called to do. And so, Matt, please let me know afterwards if you'd be interested. And then I think it's important just to like educate and advocate wherever you can. I don't know if there's a really good, like comprehensive, like refugee 101 course that you could take free with an online. If I can't find one, maybe I'll just create one, right? What else do I have to do? I know it's about. So maybe I literally just thought of that like 5 hours ago. So maybe I should bring it up tonight. Maybe I should think on it more. I'm going to go ahead and say it, and then maybe it'll make me do it. I have a blog that I've neglected terribly, but I'm going to be writing it more, called The Place Called Home. And then really important, write to your elected officials, call them, write to them. The reason we know what needs to be done, but we don't do it, not because it's that hard, but because it's politically unpopular. And I guarantee you, all the people that want refugees to stay out of our country, to stay out of whatever country they're in, or think that, maybe certain refugees are okay, but not, those other people aren't real refugees, or, they're probably just lying and they're just, illegals. Working on that language in this curriculum. They're calling their rep all the time. They're at every coffee hour. They are at every town. And your elected officials may know what they think they ought to do, but they don't think they can do it because they don't hear from us. And so that is, I'm thinking about this for myself. Like I should, once a week, I should just, hey, Alyssa, just reminding you once again, I think we need to bring more refugees to mid-Michigan. So those are suggestions I have, and I'm happy to take questions.
Oh, I have a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very much, Stephanie. This is wonderful. Very comprehensive. We do have online viewers as well. So what we'll do is we'll start with Lynn. We'll take one question from the floor, and then we'll see whether are there any questions in the chat.
Not yet.
Maybe
No.
this will stimulate some questions. Yeah. So if you're online, please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and you'll be the next after we entertain our first question from Lynn.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is very, very interesting, and your sabbatical sounds exciting. Yes, my question, I would like to hear your thoughts about the Welcome program in Canada.
Yeah, so the Welcome Corps. Is this my automation working? Hello? I don't think I broke it, but maybe I do. Hello? This is sort of early again. Okay, so thank you, Lynn, for the question. Then it asked about Welcome Corps. So there my concern about this kind of is part of a larger arc that we've seen in U.S. government broadly, where we're privatizing everything. So, we have no social safety net. We try to, we just kind of, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and we don't want to pay for anything other than military and military. So, I feel like this is a movement towards not having government expenditures for refugees. And I think it's, I'd like to, with this welcoming the new neighbor program, I'd like to address some of this, because I'm concerned that well-meaning people, yeah, let's do this, not really realize what the commitment is. So at least the U.S. government is requiring it has to be a minimum of 5 people, and they have to, I think, contribute to $10,000. Yeah, that's probably
It can be done both with groups. Be done both with groups or individuals. The other problem with new status and welcome corps is that they're not given refugee status and a pathway to citizenship. If they're called, they're designated as humanitarian provokees. All of them. Okay. I think Vermont is here, right? But most, well, there's, and every country is different, which is also very problematic. So it's something that all of them are like, Haitian, Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans who were just added in January, but then we had Ukrainians and Afghans and
Right.
Well, welcome corps, I think, is separate from that.
okay.
Like you can, yeah. So you can sponsor refugees through it's a terrible name. It is called, right? Cuban, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan, Haitian, Cuban program. I don't get the order of the countries right ever. Those are the countries. Then the Ukrainian program and the Afghan program, which are all cool names. But or somebody else, like, it just seems like it's not tied to the typical, like, who needs it the most. It's not, that's how, like, national interest is always the most, national interest is always the first one. But then, like, somebody who has, they're definitely not going to be, they cannot be in the country they're in now. And this, well, before you can just say, oh, I want to bring somebody from this country because I like them. And it doesn't, it's very disconnected. Yeah, they're not connected to any of the refugee services that the states have. Now, in Michigan, Ben Kavanaugh's office is working very hard to try to integrate regular resettlement with and connecting these sponsors to, but I don't even think he will be told by the State Department who's participating in the welcome corps. Or if he is, he has to work for it. Like, it's not automatic. It's very happenstance. And I mean, in my research here in Michigan, I've heard about situations where people came, they were brought to an apartment, they didn't have food for 2 days because the volunteers who said they were going to bring grocery didn't. And so when you have people whose job it is to do this and they're trained and they're paid, most of the time people do their jobs. Volunteers, everybody has worked with volunteers know, they said they're going to do. They don't feel that obligation because they're volunteers. And they're creating a whole system of volunteers to provide all the assistance that refugees need. So I think there's going to be a lot of very enthusiastic people who don't know what they're getting into and will be very upset when refugees don't thank them. This is really a huge thing that people just want them to be grateful. And if you're interested, there's this great book called The Ungrateful Refugee. And it really describes the mindset of, why should you be grateful? Your whole life has been upended. You've lost family members. Your whole life is destroyed. Right? So I think it's going to be a disaster, maybe. But certain states will be better than others. And I think states that really try to get ahead of all the problems, there will be fewer disasters than, and there are other states that don't have a state refugee coordinator, like we don't participate in this. And so there's no government involved. Like it's right, the states that are putting refugees on buses and shipping them to sanctuary states, so-called state, there's no such legal definition of sanctuary either. So those states are going to be a disaster because there's no government oversight at all. It's just NGOs trying to serve the refugees as best they can, and then random people saying, yeah, I'll do this. I'm a good person, and then flooding it monstrously.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah. There's a question from Peter Bird. Can we expect the number of refugees brought into the U.S. to increase under the Biden administration? And if so, to what level? And do we locally in Lansing have the infrastructure to handle an increase in refugees?
Okay, thank you for that question, Peter. Yes, so Peter had asked if we can expect more refugees under the Biden administration. If so, how many? And do we have the infrastructure in Michigan to manage resettlement of those folks? So Biden had raised, he had promised, so this is, what we need is not a refugee ceiling, what we need is a refugee floor. There is the Great Act. See, I'm really, Alice, I'm teaching you this stuff, okay? The GRACE Act, which is a legislation that would make a floor. So we never go below this number, we can't go above it when there's, but right now we just have a ceiling. Biden promised to raise it to 120. And you know, I don't think he's gonna raise it any more than that until we get close to that number. Right? Because we just nationally don't have that infrastructure. But do we have the infrastructure in Michigan? I really think we do. We have. I mean, I've done research in, you know, before I came here, I did research in California, Illinois, and Minnesota. Minnesota has an amazing system, no surprise. California, in the year and a half I was doing my dissertation, had 3 different refugee state coordinators, a lot of turnover. I mean, you know, it's a big state, a lot of big problems, but not the best run. Illinois had Ed Silverman was amazing. He's since passed away. A friend of mine teaches at University of Chicago. I want to write a book that it's amazing. And I did an interview with him, and he started, I'm like, how did you get into this? And he told me basically how he helped write the Refugee Act in 1960. So he was studying Illinois, was very well run, at least when he was there. I don't know what's going on now. But Michigan, I tell you what, we were kind of a mess for a while. And Ben Kavanaugh, I'm president of the Ben Kavanaugh Fan Club. And he's put together a really good group of folks. And we have really, really great, knowledgeable people working in different agencies across the state. I think they were good when I came here. I think it's only improved over time. Very, very solid infrastructure that we have here. And we have a lot of low-cost housing, which is a thing you look for, and a lot of entry-level jobs. We even have employers that are hounding the refugee resettlement agency saying, when are we going to bring in more refugees? We have work and no one to do the work. And so you don't resettle refugees for economic development, but for us, that it would be economic development. So I think we would do very well if we could bring in more folks.
Thank you for your comments. I just wanted to add to your list of refugee serving agencies, the agencies that serve unaccompanied refugee minors.
Yes.
Samaritas, predominantly, I believe, in Child and Family Services. And again, those agencies can't accept refugee minors unless there are foster parents that have already been licensed and have beds available and say they'll take refugee youth. And then they can get approved for settlement in Michigan. So if you could add them to
Yes.
to the list. It's a big need as well.
Thank you for bringing Samaritas up. So, I don't think of Samaritas stopping because I don't think they have as many. They're also looking for donations, but I don't think they have all applications. The big thing they have is foster parents, right? Like that is so important. So, and
And I think Child and Family Services, is that the other big one, Alice, that's serving them? Pardon me?
oh, Gil,
The school.
Yes, but I'm talking about the resettlement agencies for the unaccompanied
Bethany.
minors. Oh, Bethany,
Samaritas here and Bethany and Grand Rapids.
right, Bethany.
Yeah, so Bethany and Samaritas do foster parents, so you cannot adopt unaccompanied minor because there's no parents that can sign off on parental rights. But there doesn't need a foster parents, and you know, I think parenting is always hard, right? So it's a big decision to step into that space. But if you need to talk to somebody about what it's like, Judy Harris, who goes to our church, has how many? I don't know. She's a grandmother now. And you do talk to me. Okay, talk to Yasmin because it's
Well, I retired.
you were talking, but it's transformative, right?
Yeah, it is transformative. And, but I think Judy's up to like 12. But yes,
GIL, the Global Institute of Lansing, is a educational program that helps refugees who come here and they've aged out of this, they can't get into high school because they're told that they need that high school degree. It gives them a high school equivalency, which is super important. And they work with Lansing Community College, so students like prep to go from their high school equivalency to LCC. And really, we have great programs. I think this is Michigan is one of the top resettlement states, actually, in terms of numbers. I think it might be the top in terms of quality. We really have an amazing infrastructure.
Can I ask?
Yes.
The people feel, just today they have the graduation ceremony and 3 wonderful grades. And we congratulate with that. And speaking of resettlement agency starting this year, you can add another one because Bethany is coming to Lansing and they should be starting getting their first refugees. And for next year, I believe it will be 100.
Wow. Yeah. So Bethany Christian Church is also, and I should know this because I just got fingerprinted to be a backup child care provider for a friend of mine who's going to be fostering refugees.
They are also resettling agents.
Well, they're resettling.
Resettling agents. The second resettlement agents.
Wow. So our capacity is growing. It's growing and it's now bigger than it was before the Trump administration. So this will be the place. This is the place to look for how to do it right.
Affordable housing though,
It is more affordable than, let's say, in California, for sure. And now with an excellent housing specialist, we are doing much better. We are doing much better, but we are happy when somebody reports us, some landlords who are willing to work there.
Yes. Because people often they can't give security deposit, right? They're not coming with that kind of cash. And so, and they don't have, there's no, financial credit check you can do for folks. And so you need landlords who are willing to be flexible on these things. And some of our housing stock is so low quality, you can't put people in it. So we need to do some improvement on that. But yes, much better than other higher cost things.
Unfortunately, we're scheduled to be out of here at 8:30. And we get a very special deal from the church here and Bruce, who's has to stay here until we clear out. So we should, but the enthusiasm of the discussion shows the reflected both of the topic, but more importantly, your presentation. So, thank you very much. Robert and Lisa, because they will be in making this happen, this happened tonight. Planning on it. Because it's not an easy job, manipulating everything that needs to be done there. And we're gonna have just a quick word from Mary Flores, who's our Vice President of Membership. So those of you who are members will leave the membership form.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was great. For those of you that are here that are Luna members, thank you very much for being members. Your membership helps us be able to put on presentations, great presentations like this of Professor Nawyn. And if you're not a current member of Luna, go to luna.org. It's on our webpage. It's got all the information of the wonderful events we have. Not only do we have the Java Cafe, but we also have other events, and they're always posted on here on luna.org. And there's a link there that you can click to join Luna. You do it through the national office, the United Nations National Office, and then you have to let them know that you want to be a member. It explains it through the process. But please become a member of Luna and join us for our future events. And thank you so much for everything.
Everybody, and those who joined us online, thank you very much, and have a good evening. Thanks again, Stephanie.
Thank you.